Okay, we are back in Joshua today, and we will be until the end of the summer, by the way. So remember he said, be strong and courageous. Those two words on the right there is strong and courageous in Hebrew, is chazak and ametz. And the chazak word means to be strong, not strong. Looks bad on me, doesn't it? That's sad. But not that kind of strong, because, they're going in to conquer a land of people who are in this land they're not supposed to be. It's not that kind of strong. It's a strong we talked about like epoxy glue, where you adhere yourself to something and don't let go. That's what epoxy does. Super glue, not quite as much, but epoxy does, okay? So got some of you started on a whole life of investigating epoxy. I'm glad about that. But anyway, so strong is the chazak is, stay strong on that. What is it? The truth of God, his promises. And the ametz part is actually the application of that. So that's strong and courageous. Apply that truth that you know in the difficult situations coming up. So courageous isn't a bad word, but it's not courageous because you're just denying your fear. It's courageous because you know the truth. So it's two different things. So we're looking at chapter 4 and 5 today. And I'm going to give you just a super quick overview just in case you wonder where we are. There's 24 chapters in Joshua. We're going to go through all of them by the end of the summer. And by the way, we're going through this at light speed. Light speed. We are not walking our way through it. We're actually running through it. It'll take us on the average 2 chapters a week. And we're going to do 2 chapters today. Well, that's an awful lot. Are we going to be here till 2? Yes. No, we're not. In fact, in just a second, I'm going to read for you all of chapters 4 and 5. And you know how long it'll take? 7 minutes. But I read kind of fast. So anyway, so we're going to read that today. So we are down here in chapters 4 and 5 at the end of the preparation period. Chapters 1 through 5 is about a 5-month period. It took 5 months from chapter 1 to get us to chapter 6 next week. 5 months right here, and we're in the end of that preparation. After that, there's 7 years of conquering. Yeah, it'll take 7 years for them to sweep through the land and push out the people who should not be there. And then another 8 years of just settling it. So once the bad guys are gone, it takes 8 years just to get everyone in their right places. And that includes not only settling the 12 tribes in their different places, but also setting up a couple of special cities. And they're really interesting. I mean, read ahead if you want to. That's a fascinating thing that God said, okay, the tribes can settle, but I need some special cities. And again, we're not talking about places like you would guess, like Jerusalem. It's not on the list. Special city. So we'll get to that. And then also, finally, conditions to staying in the land, which is very, very important in terms of why they're there and how God will allow them to stay there. So we're in we're in the end of the 5 months of preparation before starting the fighting. We've crossed the Jordan River, and the Jordan River, which goes up and down, and it comes down from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea, is sort of a demarcation line between being in the Promised Land and being out of the Promised Land. However, if you're a Bible student, you know that part of the Promised Land is actually on the right side of the Jordan River. There's 2.5 tribes that settle there eventually, Reuben and Gad, and then half of Manasseh. They settle over there on the eastern side of the Jordan. And so as we come across into the Jordan River, and we're getting ready to do some fighting and some conquering, God says to the people who don't really have to cross, because they're going to settle on that right side, he says, but you guys, if you've got soldiers, your soldiers have to cross with us, and your women and children can stay out here. Leave some people to defend them, but you need to send your soldiers. So they're coming with us today too. So that's what we're looking at. And here's more of a Google Earth view of that thing. We started, that dark line right there is the Jordan River Valley. And by the way, it's fatter than a river because it turns out, is this still on? Yeah. It turns out that the Jordan River periodically and very predictably flows so much it floods the plain wide, and so you can plant stuff there. That's why that's like that. Jericho is actually up in elevation, a couple hundred feet above the Jordan River, and it's a tiny piece of land by comparison, but it's impenetrably walled with a double wall system. And next week when we actually get to the edge of Jericho, I'll talk about that because there's some great archaeology about that. But we're not quite there yet. We still have to do some preparation. Well, so when we do these final preparations, I ask myself, and I do this before I read passages, since I know we're in the last final preparations before knocking on the door at Jericho, what's the last things we have to do to get ready for? So I was thinking, well, as a kid, my dad used to always lecture us about being prepared for car trips. So I thought, okay, this looks like the car I used to have when I was a kid. It really does. It was almost identical. Why did they put wood on the side of station wagons? And by the time it got to my age, it wasn't real wood anymore. It was kind of like a plastic wood. So the longer you owned the car, the plastic wood started to look more like plastic and less like wood. In fact, there's a very strange thing in our culture where we try and make our wood look like plastic and our plastic look like wood. Have you noticed that? That's just a freebie. Okay, so my dad would say, okay, before we're going a long trip, and for us that was going up the East Coast to my grandmother's house in upstate New York, he'd say, okay, what we got to do, we got to check the oil, okay? We got to check the coolant, which, by the way, back then we didn't call it coolant. You know what we called it? Water. I don't know why. In fact, that confused me as a child because sometimes we would have salads, and you could have your ranch dressing, or you could have your oil and water dressing, and all I could think of was, oh, that's disgusting. Motor oil and that water that's greenish that goes in the car? Don't eat that. Anyway, that confused me. So he said, no, we got to prepare final preparation. Check the oil, check the coolant, check the tires, that there's air in the tires, yeah. Check the spare that's in the back. That's super duper important. I needed that this last week. I had a flat tire, and sure enough, the spare had air in it. Thank you, God. Okay, so you got to check the spare. You got to check that you packed your stuff, socks, underwear, stuff. I'll get all the luggage in there. And my dad used to always joke. He says, yeah, and we always make sure we got all the kids. Ho, 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 ho. I didn't listen to that, though, evidently, because we left our son behind 3 times. Once on Easter morning. So, we left church. We were in 2 cars. There's the problem. If you got a lot of kids, don't take 2 cars. Because we were going to another place, and we got to the other place, and we went, uh-oh. We're missing a child. So we went back, and he wasn't back at the church. Well, some very nice person took pity on him and said, looks like your parents left you here. Would you like to come to our house and do an Easter egg hunt? Sure. And eat chocolate? Sure. So we had to call around. I didn't listen to my dad. Check for the kids. And then what else? Oh, then you got to make sure you have snacks. So with that, you're all set to go. You can just take off. That's enough preparation. Boom, you're out of here. I was thinking, does that help me in terms of Joshua getting on the edge of starting to fight in Jericho? What kind of preparations have we not done yet? So then I thought, oh, wait, this isn't really a car trip because they're actually camped right next to Jericho. They're not traveling much today. They're right there. So it's not, you have to prepare for a war. Okay. Oh, I forgot to mention this. My mom would always wished we'd had one of those. Because then you don't have to pack the car back quite as big. Okay, let's prepare for a war. What does a war look like? Well, it looks more like this, okay? So when you prepare for war, you have to check all your equipment, make sure everything's ready to go. So if you're going to go in there and you're going to knock down Jericho, and you're talking about swords and spears and stuff like that, so, a good warrior would take a look at their weapon, make sure it's clean, make sure it works and stuff like that. Then you got to make sure you got good boots down there, you're wearing good boots. You lose your footing as a soldier, you're dead, so boots and then all that stuff in between that's classified. You got to make sure all that stuff kind of works as well, and I don't even know what most of that stuff is. Oh, I know what those are goggles, so you got to make sure your goggles are clear. So that's what you do, right? Before you go into a battle, you check to make sure that your equipment works, right? Except if you've read forward in this narrative, you know that that's not very important. Because in a moment, Jericho's going to fall, not because your weapons work, but because of something else. Don't want to be a spoiler alert. I'm not going to tell you right now. You've never heard the story. So I come back to my original question. What are the final preparations that still need to be done? They're in chapters 4 and 5. And I would posit that the things that still need to be done to prepare isn't what we would think we need to prepare for. I would pick any of those things right now. It's what God knows we need to be prepared for that we're short of. That's what we're going to see in chapters 4 and 5. What does God know they need to be prepared for that they're not even thinking of? Okay? And this is just such a cool passage for this particular reason. And it's going to be an illustration of what God's final preparations are, not ours. Now, just to make a quick point, we'll make this several times. When you're on the beginning of a very challenging unknown, Anyone ever been at the beginning of a challenging unknown? And we all are. You still may be. If you're in the beginning of a challenging unknown, you don't even know what you should be worried about sometimes. So you don't even know what to be prepared for. So this is a great case of saying, so if I don't know what the challenge is, if I don't know how it's going to go down, if I don't really know what's happening, what do I do to prepare? God knows how I need to prepare. So your prayer is always, God, will you prepare me for this next stage? I'm looking to you, okay? So this will tell us a clue about what that might be in the future for you. So we're going to do it with 4 small pictures. There's one. There's another, and there's another. And that's going to be the 4 stages of our preparation. Now, if you've read ahead, you know what those pictures mean. Don't tell anyone next to you. Don't spoil it. Okay, so here we go. So I'm going to read this for you, and we're going to start with the stones right there, and we'll see how this goes. So we're in chapter 4 of Joshua. So let me read this for you. If you have an ESV, follow with me if you like. If you don't, it's going to be clumsy to match the words, so just listen. That's okay. So we start in Joshua 4. So when all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, take 12 men of the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying this, take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan. Okay, remember the Jordan was opened up, in the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you and lay them down in the place where you're lodging tonight. Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, which is dry right now, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder. So it's not a pebble, it's a big thing, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you. So when your children ask in time to come, well, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. And when it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. So the people did just as Joshua commanded. They took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, just as the Lord told Joshua. They carried them up over with them to the place where they lodged and laid them down there. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan. In the place where the feet of the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant had stood. And they're there to this very day. Whoa. Let's go find them. Oh, okay, sorry. And they're there to this very day. For the priests bearing the Ark stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished that the Lord commanded Joshua to tell the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. So the people passed over in haste. And when all the people had finished passing over, the ark of the Lord and the priests passed over before the people, and the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh passed over armed before the people of Israel, as Moses had told them. About 40,000 ready for war passed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho. And on that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him just as they had stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life. And the Lord said to Joshua, command the priests bearing the ark of the testimony to come up out of the Jordan. Come up out of the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests, come up out of the Jordan. And when the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord came up from the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet were lifted onto dry ground, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place, and they overflowed its banks as before. The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and you may fear the Lord your God forever. Chapter 5. Well, as soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, that's the Mediterranean, so kings on that side, when they heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they'd crossed over, their hearts melted. And there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. So at that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives. Dun, dun, dun. You always know when someone says make flint knives. So make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel a second time. Oh, yeah. So Joshua made flint knives. He circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath-Haaraloth. By the way, if you're into words, Gibeath-Haaraloth was named after this event. Gibeath means mound of, and you can look up the rest. Okay, and this is the reason why Joshua circumcised him. See, all the males of the people who came out of Egypt, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they'd come out of Egypt. Though all the people who came out had been circumcised, yet all the people who were born on the way in the wilderness after they'd come out of Egypt, they'd not been circumcised. For the people of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not obey the voice of the Lord. And the Lord swore to them that he would not let them see the land that the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So it was their children. It was their children whom he raised up in their place that Joshua circumcised. For they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. When the circumcising of the whole nation was finished, they remained in their places in the camp until they were all healed. And the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. And so the name of the place is called Gilgal to this very day. Gilgal, by the way, means rolled away. What? Gilgal means rolled away the reproach. Okay, so when the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening in the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day that they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain, and the manna ceased the day after they ate the produce of the land. And there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan for a year. Whoa. For that year. Finally, when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes, and he looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with a drawn sword. When someone says, make flint knives, what? And then when someone stands before you with a sword, you go, what? Second what? There's a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? And he said, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord, and now I have come. Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. Is holy. And Joshua did so. Preparation done. And the next breath, in the next couple sentences, we take on Jericho. So why were these essential preparations? I mean, what? Okay, so this is where interpreting narratives like this, stories like this, are really fun. Because after you get done reading through a section, the best thing for you to do is take a couple steps back and go, what does that all mean? Why did God choose what he chose? How and in what way does that actually prepare them before they hit Jericho? I don't understand how this stuff all plays together. And you can take the story of this narrative, since it's so portable, And you can walk around, you can go to work, you can wash dishes, you can mow the lawn, and you can still think about this. I don't get why, what? Why is this important? Now remember, the Israelites have a need, and their need is to stem the fear of their very first battle in the Promised Land. I mean, this is intimidating. They're going to come across now, the very first battle, the most entrenched fortress-like city in all of Israel. And it's number one on their list. So you got to understand, if you're thinking like an Israelite, this is spooky. Okay, so in the previous generation, God parted the Red Sea. Okay, I get that. And he killed all the Egyptian army. Okay, I get that. And now here, a generation later, he parted, the Jordan. Well, I get that. But still, Jericho is Jericho. And it stands today because it's rebuffed every single assault on it forever. It's impenetrable. So why is this a preparation? So this is where you go back and you noodle on this for a while. And I want you to think on this with me. The stones. Let's go back to the stones. It occupies the entirety of chapter 4. Stones. And so remember, every tribe sent a man down to get a stone he could carry on his shoulder. It's not a pebble. This is a stone. And to bring these 12 stones together. Actually, when they brought them up, they didn't make a cairn like this. They didn't stack them. They took them back to where they were camping. And if you think about over 1 million people camping, they're spread out. So they took one to every one of their camps. They're spread out. Oh, and they use that stone as a memorial thing for the kids to ask what that's all about. Now, if you've ever been to Israel and you've seen the rocks, right? And you've seen the rocks there don't look like our rocks here. Like, for instance, if you were to look down on the ground and look at a rock that's just sort of kicking around when you're in the forest or something like that, the odds are 50-50 that you'll see a rock that's all craggy and sharp, or you'll see a rock that's rounded like a pebble, because it's been a stream. You don't see any rounded rocks in Israel because there's no water around. So to see this weird, I mean, think bowling ball round. To see this weird, round, maybe mossy rock sitting out in the middle of the Jericho plain amidst all this craggy limestone and junk rock that's around there. You look at that and it's going to cause a question. People are going to say, well, what is that? And how did that get here? I mean, what's that all about? So it was all by itself, by its nature, it would draw questions. And the children especially, who maybe had never seen a river rock in their life, would say, that's odd. What is that and why is that here? So that's why Joshua said, when they ask you, say, listen, you haven't seen a rock like this because this came from the bottom of the Jordan River. Well, how did you get it from the bottom of the Jordan River? Because God stopped the Jordan River one day, and we walked over and picked it up and brought it here. You mean God stopped the Jordan River? Yes. And since we are typical human beings that so quickly forget the amazing things that just previously happened to us, I imagine that the Israelites could be on that plain of Jericho, and they could look back out now at the Jordan River, which has now started flowing, and ask themselves, gosh, was that all a dream? I mean, okay, it stopped, but now look, it's overflowing the bank. It says, whoosh, it's everywhere. Did we really walk across that? Well, we got this mossy bowling ball. Yes, we did. And God stopped that. By the way, too, that's really central to the miracle of stopping the Jordan River. Not that it actually stops flowing, because the Jordan River does periodically stop flowing, even to this very day. Depends on the season, stuff like that. But what was the season that it stopped in this case? It was the season when it had too much water. It overflowed the banks. It spread out wide. So I'm sure if some of the kings over in the west part of the country who are fearing the God of Israel sees these people on the other side of this overflowing river, they're saying, well, we're okay, because who can cross a river like that, really? So that's why he mentions in the passage, when the kings of the west heard that the Jordan was dried up, they went, oh no. Oh no. We thought it was a natural barrier. This God who did this thing 40 years ago in the Red Sea now has done this. We're toast. And that's why their hearts melted. Because not during flood season. Are you kidding me? He does. So what does that mean? Why set up a remembrance of what God had done? In fact, that's what this is. This is deliberately to remember God's history with you and your nation. To remember what he's done. Why do you need that? when you're on the cusp of something that's unknown and threatening, the first thing you need to do is say, well, when I look back in my past, God was faithful there. He'll be faithful here. That's remembering God's history. I think that's all it is. It's really that simple. So as they stand between the rock in their campsites and this impenetrable stone wall fortress of Jericho, they can look around at that rock and say, well, I know it doesn't mean much, that old mossy, green, round bowling ball of rock, but it reminds me that God tangibly and in reality interceded on our behalf. So if he's done that in the past, he'll do that in the future. That's actually the first thing you need to do when you're facing the unknown. Is remember God's history. Do you have a history with God? Yeah, see, this is a really important thing. It's a super important thing. In the process, God tells Joshua, you need to do this for your kids, because what you're doing is you're establishing the history with your kids as well. But don't be mistaken. This is also establishing history with the adults that are right there too. They could always look at that and say, well, the Jordan's flowing today, but I saw God part it, and I'm an eyewitness. And this rock right here is speaking out as a witness to what God's done. In a real sense, from the New Testament, that rock cries out. Ooh, okay. So that's what that's all about. So as simply as that, when you're facing the unknown and you're fearing for your existence, remember God's history for you. Now, I use this all the time. I mean, all the time. This has become a reflex in my life, is when I come across something where I shrug my shoulders and say, God, I don't know what to do here. I don't know what this is all about. I don't know what this means. I don't know why you've put me here. I say that a lot, actually. I don't know what this is all about. But you have been faithful in the past, in the immediate past and in the far past. You'll be faithful now. And that's not just wishful thinking, by the way. That's not just hoping against hopes. That's saying that there is a fact of the universe of God's involvement in my life, and that fact is going to proceed. It's a fact. So there you go. And God has been very careful to preserve this factual history in your life so that when your soul is weak, you can say, the facts about God don't change. And he's been faithful back there. He's faithful here. I do that all the time. I hope you do that all the time. It's the very first reflex. So in the first of these 4 final preparations that God does for Israel, he's trying to tell them, you need to put in place a remembrance of the fact of what I have done for you. It's concrete, it's real, it's tangible. I did that for you, so when you face the unknown may be unknown, but the God who's fighting on your behalf is not. Fact. Okay, that's number 1. What do you make of this? In Romans 8, he says this is like a New Testament twist on this. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, that's the history, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, well, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? History, future, right there. Based on the consistent faithfulness of God in your life. In your life. Now, I would also suggest that you need to do something, I don't want to use the word artificial, but I'll say artificial. Something semi-artificial. When God does great things in your life, you need to memorialize this. And I'm not talking about putting a pile of rocks in your front yard, but you need to do something because it'll slip out of your memory. And I do this as well too, where I'll stop. Not only do I thank God for what he's done, but I say to myself, you know what, I want to remember this. I want to actually put a stone down in my memory and in my experience that says I want to come back to this in the future. If you're a journaler, write it in a journal. If it's, if you're a painter, paint something. Just do something to take the experience of what you've done with God, like they did with the stones, and make something you can come back to and say, there was this day. There was this day. Many times what I do is I memorize dates that God did that. So I'll say, okay, that was this date. And on that date, God did this. And the reason I use a date is because it's super concrete. It's like that day, this happened, and I'm not going to forget that. So do something to memorialize. It's not a trivializing thing, he says, to stack these rocks. These rocks are important. And so you need to somehow pay tribute to what happened so that you will remember. By the way, Ebenezer? Scrooge? No. Ebenezer is actually a Hebrew word that really means this kind of tribute, this kind of memorial thing is what Ebenezer means. So, this my Ebenezer that I safely came, and by thy good pleasure will arrive at my home. That's from a song I've kind of paraphrased. So he sets this as his Ebenezer, as his marker, won't change. There it is. Now, before we move on to the next thing, this is a question I have, and I haven't answered, and maybe you can. But there was 2 rock events here. They took rocks out of the Jordan, right? And then Joshua took some rocks, sounds like that's a different bunch, and put them into the Jordan. And then the water covered it up. Why? I don't know. I'll let you work on that. However, if someone somehow, maybe during the dry season of the Jordan, because I told you it does naturally stop flowing at some, during the dry season, if someone crossed at that spot and they're walking across and there's mossy rocks, and then suddenly they saw these jagged, cut from the ground pieces of limestone sitting conspicuously, 12 of them in the middle of the Jordan, that would stop them. They go, oh, these don't belong here. So it could very well be a testimony for people who'd come during the dry season. I don't know. But that's an interesting thing. Okay, let's move on to the next, the prep. The flint knives. Bum, bum, bum. Okay, so remember, circumcision was instituted by God with Abraham, and with Abraham, Genesis, help me, I think 17, somewhere in that range, 16, 17, 18. So he establishes with Abraham, and he says to Abraham, you need to circumcise your males, because this is really going to be a sign. It's a symbol. He calls it that. It's a symbol of your citizenship in my land that I'm in charge of. That's kind of what it was. It was a mark of citizenship, following God, allowing him to be provider. So that's what that was. So sure enough, when they left Egypt, they were doing this in Egypt for 4 centuries. They were doing this circumcision, evidently. But then when they left Egypt, came to the Red Sea, came and wandered in the desert, sent some spies up into the land to check it out before they took over the promised land, and they came back and said, oh, we can't go in there, there's giants. Except for Joshua and Caleb. Hey! They said we can't go into the land. God promised us that land. God's promise must be bad, because after all, is God bigger than giants? And Joshua looked at Caleb and said, yeah. And God said, nope, if you guys want to live in the desert, I'll let you live in the desert until you die. If that's your choice. And so God let them for 4 decades stay in the desert, right? But while they were in the desert waiting for everyone to die, they didn't circumcise their kids. Now that's an interesting thing, because they were doing it before they left Egypt. So why did they stop? We could only speculate on that, but the speculation is not that far afield. I mean, think about it. If you were one of the people who came to the edge of the promised land and you heard about the giants and you said, no, I think I'd rather go back to Egypt, what you're saying is, I disbelieve the promises of God. I disbelieve the might and power of God to carry out his promises. That's a fundamental disbelief. And when you jump into Hebrews in the New Testament, he says they didn't enter the land because of disbelief. In what? In the veracity of the promise and God's ability to bring it about. So those people feel like in the desert they've been abandoned by God. God's not going to follow through with his promise. Now he's going to make us die out here. Why should we circumcise our kids? They're not members of any nation anymore. We're vagabonds. We don't have a nation. We don't have a land. He's kept us out of the land. I mean, why should we show the marks of citizenship in God's community if God hasn't given us a community, because he's kept us out of the land? So the speculation is that's what they're thinking. And so when the kids are born over that 40 years, should we circumcise them? No. Because God stood us up. We're not going to mark our kids as being his. It's actually a really natural reaction. So before they go into Jericho and start the fight, God says to Joshua, you got to make sure that these kids understand that they're part of my nation. They're part of the promise. They haven't been excluded from the promise. And all the time up there before being circumcised, they were really outsiders of the nation because they weren't circumcised. So you need to remind them what? That they're citizens of my nation. And there's number 2. They need to remember that they're God's people. That's all. That's really all that is. There's no magic in the circumcision. It's just a way of saying, my promise has extended to you that I started with Abraham. My promise is extended to you. And remember, when God talked to Abraham about the promise, in a lickety-split of a couple sentences, he said, and so you need to circumcise your boys to kind of be a symbol of the fact that the promise goes to them and their children, their children, their children. So they need to be members. They need to be reminded they are members of a nation with God at the head. And this circumcision will tell them that. They need to know that. They're not orphans at all. Now, for us, when we're facing uncertainty and fear and doubt and stuff like that, this is the second thing I do. I say, well, wait a second. I think I belong to God. See, that changes everything. Because fear and uncertainty usually is a statement emotionally that I'm all alone and I am unfit to tackle the things that are coming my way. And that actually is true. But you're not alone. You're a member of God's people. So that's the reminder that he does. I want them to understand that they're my people and the promise goes to them as well. It's just so important when you face uncertainty to realize that not only God has a history with me, but he just says, you're mine. You'll be my people. I'll be your God. So when you face the uncertainty, you can say, well, gee, I'm God's child. Which reminds me of a verse in the New Testament. 1 John 3:1. See what kind of love the Father has given to us that we should be called children of God? And so we are. I always make that crazy right there. And we are. We are. I just love John's, I just love the way, isn't it amazing God loves us so much to call us his children? And we are. That's an astonishing thing. Because we're a collection of reprobates. Selfish-oriented, self-seeking, self-consumed, nasty to other people. We are reprobates. The idea I think of when I think of children is when you look at us, we are not natural-born children of God. We are outside of his family. There's just no question about that. And there's just no question. And so I think more of a, like a Charles Dickens novel where you see all the orphans that are living off the street and stuff like that, black faces and just barely getting by and stuff. Cast-offs that nobody cares about. All they care about is making use of them and use them and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of what we were. We were little gutter snipes scrabbling away from day to day trying to figure out how to live, thinking God must hate me. Why am I here and other people aren't? I mean, that's us. That's us. That's us. And then he comes along and he looks at us in the gutter and he takes us by the hand and says, you're my child now. Yeah. Well, but I'm not related to you. I know. You're my child simply because I say so. And that's us. That's why in John's statement he's so amazed. Look at the love that God shows us by calling us his children. And hey, we are. We are. Because God said so. Wow. That's exactly this last thing about remembering you're God's people. You're God's child. He came and grabbed you by the hand and said, you're pretty dirty looking. You're pretty unkempt. Most people wouldn't love you, but I want you to know I love you tremendously with a love that you're just going to begin to understand right now. I'm going to make you my child. I'm going to bring you into my family. You're mine forever. Nothing can break that. Yes, that is just an astonishing truth. And so when you face the impenetrable fortresses of life like Jericho, you have to remind yourself, I belong to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He's taken me by the hand and brought me to himself. I'm his. Period. That changes every fortress that you come up against. Okay, let's move on. The third thing in the preparations is matzah. Well, that's matzah. That's unleavened bread that you use during Passover. But they did a Passover. They did the Passover. Wow. One of my biggest questions, I'm just a logistics freak, is were they carrying lambs with them? don't know, but they must have because they did Passover. But if you remember, Passover includes not only a lamb in part of the ceremony, but immediately, starting on that day, you go into a week of unleavened bread. That happens right there. And to this very day, Jews, when they celebrate Passover, they do what is instructed to them in Exodus, I'm guessing again, 12, I think, when this is all instituted. And God says, when you start the Passover with the lamb, then immediately on that same day, you clean your whole house out of leaven. And I lived in a Jewish neighborhood in the East Coast, and they would do this on the first day of Passover. They'd send the kids in, and they would sweep the entire house of raised bread. Just, gone. And, whether there was some there or not doesn't matter, but they would ceremonially go through every cupboard in the kitchen. They would open every cupboard in the entire house. They're looking for this stuff. And there's kind of a funny ceremony. I've never understood this, but they would sweep out the crumbs in the cabinets. Sometimes bread crumbs show up in cabinets. You didn't want to touch those, so they would take a feather and they'd sweep them into a saucer. Throw them away. So this was a cleaning process. That's why you did that, because it looked like a broom in that sense. You would completely clean the entire house of yeast bread, the entire place. And then from that time for the next week, you would only eat bread that was unleavened. Matzah. Okay? To symbolize that quick exit out of Egypt. And so to this very day, that's part of Passover. Well, that's what they did in the desert here. But now here's the question. Did they make their matzah out of manna? No, it says in the passage they found stuff there to make it with. And the day after they ate that unleavened bread with the stuff they found there, manna stops. That's pretty cool, actually. Manna stops. Did you realize that they were living off manna all the way up through crossing the Jordan River and up to that first encampment and stuff? I mean, they were manna's still coming down. 4 decades. Manna's still coming down. Until they do the Passover, and they celebrate in the Passover, at the center of the Passover, they celebrate God's rescue of them out of Egypt. Right? Rescues them out of Egypt, right? And that's what they're celebrating. So now we're on the cusp of moving into the promised land. We're going to celebrate God getting us out of the bad place, and that's connected with God putting us into the good place. So in this remembrance, God wants them to be prepared, number 3, on this, that they'll remember God's rescue. Now that's an important thing. That's an important thing. They spent over 4 centuries in Egypt. Started out as a pretty sweet deal, and then the sweet deal started to be not quite a sweet deal, and then suddenly became imprisoned and enslaved by the sweet deal people, and suddenly you're slaves. It happens in a handful of generations. So what he wanted them to do was celebrate the fact, a specific piece of God's history, which was, God has rescued you. Now that's huge. When you look through the narratives of the entire Old Testament, I'll have to count this up someday, but it's so frequently when Israel is on the beginning of something that's really tough, God steps in and says, hey, I'm the God that got you out of Egypt. It's the first thing he says. I'm the God that got you out of Egypt. And your conclusion is supposed to be, oh, well, then he's got this. Yes, it's a very key piece of history. Now, how do we translate that to us today? Well, do you know that the word salvation in the New Testament, literally in the Greek, means to be released from a small place into a large open place? That's what it means. It's like being in jail and being released down in an open place. So salvation means rescue. So for us, this translates into us saying, you need to remember that God got you rescued. Now, the question is, okay, so God got me rescued out of the bad place. I'm saved from the small place, but what am I saved to is the bigger question. It's not just that God got me free, now I have my liberty, I can do anything I want to. It's as though when God rescues you from a particular place, he's got an agenda in mind. He's taking you from to something else, to life with him. And so this whole rescue idea is the idea of you being pulled out of the things that overwhelmed you and overpowered you, but nonetheless, God came in and he unlocked the doors, or like he did with Paul and Silas and all those guys, he busted off the prison doors. I mean, just can do anything. And he pulled you out of that and said, I've got a much better idea for you. And this is life. This is life. And he saved us. And we can go back to that. Look at this in Titus. It's exactly what he's mentioning in Titus. when the goodness and the loving kindness of God our Savior appeared, he saved us. He rescued us. And not because of works done by us in righteousness, but according to his own mercy. Oh, man, double amens. Isn't that just stunning? Isn't that just stunning? He saved us, the goodness and the kindness of the Lord, he saved us. Not because we were hot stuff, because we're street urchins. He saved us, and not because of what we could do to impress him or to earn his respect. None of that, because that's impossible. He did it 100% based on his mercy. That's his love empowered into his actions. To those who don't deserve it, that's grace. That's us. He does it because he is who he is, not because of what we are or what we've earned in his respect. This verse staggers me every time I see it. For years I've said, I got to memorize this. And I haven't been successful. I don't know why. I'm just slow. But what it does do is it draws me back to Titus 3 so I can reread it. And that whole section in Titus 3 is... it's great. It's great. Can I read it again? When the goodness and the loving kindness of God our Savior, our rescuer, appeared, he rescued us from sin. And Jesus says if you sin, you're imprisoned in it. You're a slave to it. That's the small place. He saved us not because of works done by us in righteousness, like I had any, but according to his own mercy. And that's what I celebrate when I go back and I remember God's rescue of me. So when I'm facing something that looks threatening and dangerous and overwhelming and way out of my league to do with, I look at that and say, yeah, but you know what? I used to be in a small place that was impossible for me, and God busted me out of that to something else. So I'm okay. It's really a significant part of God's history for you. He saved you. He saved you. The street urchin, dirty, dirt on your face, unkempt hair, lice, holes in your shoes, whole 9 yards. And he saved us. What a great thing to remember. He saved us to something as much as from something. Okay, and then final preparation is this. Whoa, I like this one. I had other kind of pictures for this that were just a little bit too over the top, so we'll just leave it right there. But this is to remember God's power. Simple enough as that. It's simple enough as that. It's interesting because in the narrative it says Joshua's out there looking at Jericho. I get this picture of him walking out of the camp at night and staring at this imposing structure going, oh man, I don't know. This is nuts. I mean, he's out there. It sounds like he's all by himself. And he's just looking at this thing, which all by itself, it proclaims its power and its might and its impenetrability. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. But Joshua is a man of faith. He's one of the two guys that came back as the spies and said, we can go in there. God will take the giants. It's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. We'll be okay. So Joshua's a man of faith. He understands this. But really still, when you are face to face with the thing, it tends to stagger you. Really, it just tends to stagger you. It tests your faith like nothing else does. And graciously, God doesn't have to do this. Graciously, God has this being show up while Joshua is staring at this problem. I just love the picture of this. And while he's out there staring at this problem, as far as we know, no one else is there. No one else is mentioned. And of course, Joshua's first question is what? Do you remember the question? Are you first or are you against? Yeah. Are you on our side or are you on their side? And his cagey answer is, nope. Wait. I asked, no, that's not an answer that's in, no, you can't say no. You got to say us or them. That's the only answer you can give. You can't say no. But he doesn't act like that. But that's what would be going in his head. So are you for us or are you for those guys? No. But I'm a captain of the army of the Lord. That's who he's for. He's for God. He's for God. And Joshua already knows that God is for the nation of Israel. He knows that. But this guy's not going to say, oh yeah, I'm a captain of the army of the Lord, and Joshua, buddy, you're in charge of things. You just tell us what you need to do, and we'll be on your side. Because when you say, are you on my side, it really means you're going to take orders from me. And this guy says, nope. Are you first or are you against us? Nope. But I am in charge of all of God's army. Oh, okay. That's reassuring. And it recenters Joshua back to, I can't do this. I can't even get these people to help me, talk this guy into it. That doesn't matter. They are working for God and they take his commands, and we are God's people. All these other reminders, we're God's people. We have history with God. He has rescued us from Egypt, all this kind of stuff. And now he's just giving me, in a very gracious, doesn't need to do it, a gracious, visible sign that he is with us. And it seems like that's just for Joshua. It always touches me deeply, because Joshua is supposed to be the stalwart of faith. But I think at this moment it's starting to waver. Something about the tangibility of the threat that just, it calls that, I can dream up situations in the apocalyptic post-Christian world that I wonder, how will I respond when this happens, or when this happens, or will I really be up for that? When I see the threat itself? When there's a gun pointed at my head, will I really? That kind of stuff. And Joshua's in this position right now. And God very graciously says, I'll send the chief guy who's in charge of the entire army. That'll put your fears to rest. And he does. Another thing that I really like about this is when the guy shows up, his words, let me just read them because I don't want to butcher them. He says something very specific. In the end of this preparation, 5 months of preparation, so are you for us or for our adversaries? Nope. But I am the commander of the army of the Lord. And then he says one more thing. Now I have come. Now I have come. So there could be some fear on Joshua's part. Well, I know that God is for us. But is he ready? I mean, we're starting this like tomorrow. I mean, is God actually here now? Is he here now? Is he ready now? I know God's interested, but is he here now? And this guy says, yeah, now I have come. Now. We're done. So that's a remarkable statement of presence in the moment of the threat. I mean, comes down right to the clock at the right time. It reminds me of other passages where it talks about Michael being engaged in some battles worldwide someplace else. He's a little delayed, then he finally gets in and says, okay, I'm here now. Well, this is the same kind of thing. I know God's in charge. I know there's a host of angels that God commands. But is he here now? Are we ready? Now look, when you're on the cusp of tremendously hard things, the biggest question you ask is, I know God loves me, but is he here now? Really? Now? I can't guarantee you that he'll send a guy with a sword. It hasn't happened to me yet. But I know that when I raise that question in my own mind, is God here now? I go, well, of course he is. What's causing me to doubt that he's here right now? I mean, really? Of course he's here right now. And so I say, yeah, he's here. So just as much as the threat is here, God is here. Now, he's here now. And so that's why this being has this catchphrase. Now I have come. I'm with you, man. Or I'm right here. But I take my commands from the Lord of hosts, not from you, Joshua. And if God is engaged in his love for us, how can we be separated from his love? He has a host of heaven. The Tzavah is what that's called, the host of heaven, that are there awaiting God's command. So God is never without ability, and he's never caught off guard. Every time we're in the midst of this beginning of this trauma stage of things that threaten us, we ask, is God here now? And we can say, yep, he's here. But don't ask the question, is God on my side or the other guy's side? That kind of is a subtle twist in the entire thing. All you need to do is say, I'm his child. He loves me. We have history. We're good. He saved me from to life with him. Okay? Whew. So these four things, like I say, this is why I love narratives, because you can just stand back and look at them and say, what are these four things? Okay, well, they're the remembering key issues that'll change your entire heart in the midst of threat, right? You can remember God's history in your life, what he's done, and specifically in that, remember that he has called you to be his, and that doesn't change. That won't change with the threat that's coming up. You can remember a specific piece of history that God rescued you, he saved you. He didn't do that just to have you annihilated tomorrow. You know, you're his. And you can remember that God not only loves me, but he's able to intercede on my behalf. And by the way, he's here now. It's super practical. So in the next breath, next time we look at this, they're going to be standing in front of the most impenetrable fortress in the world. Oh, by the way, just one New Testament quote on this I forgot about. This is great. This really ties up with God's power. God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure that in jars of clay, that's your body. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Oh, yeah. And in the facing threats, you forget that. This incredible power is in you, Christ in you. That's super important. Okay, we need to wrap things up here. I just love this list. This is the preparation, the final preparation that I would never have guessed to do. But God says this is what you need. And in his wisdom, he preps us that way. Okay, so next week, not actually next week, I'm not going to be preaching next week, but I'll be here next week. Steve's going to fill in for me while I'm talking to the high schoolers all week, but I'll be here doing music. But we're going to look at the impenetrable Jericho. And I'll give you some archaeological info as well as what's really well known and accepted by archaeologists. This thing is impenetrable. There's no way you can go from the outside in. But that doesn't say you can't go from the inside out. Oh, plot spoiler, sorry, that's what happened. So we're going to sing this song as we go because this is exactly all those things that you remember. You do that step by step every single day as a discipline. God, you're near me. God, you love me. God, I'm yours. You have history with me that proves your faithfulness and your love toward me. You saved me. You rescued me out of the tight place that I was in sin. And you're powerful enough to have your love enacted in my life. And so I take another step tomorrow. That same thing. Step by step. Okay, let me pray and then we'll sing our way out. Father in heaven, we thank you for these incredibly encouraging words. How gracious you were to Israel in the face of insurmountable fortresses. How gracious you are to us in the moments we face day by day, week by week, the things that challenge us and that threaten us, that cause us to fear. And Father, I pray through your Spirit that's in us that you would build in us the discipline and the habit of remembering these things when those things end up overwhelming our senses and taking over our fears, that we would remember that we have a sweet history with you. That includes you rescuing us from the streets as street urchins. It includes the fact that you've called us your children, and we are. And it includes the fact that you've demonstrated your power in our life and will continue to use your power to engage your love on our behalf. So, Father, I pray you build that discipline into us like you did with the Israelites as they got ready to be prepared to come to Jericho for something that should not take place, but it did because you're there and you're there now. So thanks for all these great words to us. They encourage us. And thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.